Good morning. Good morning and welcome to the Equity and Partnership Subcommittee. I'm going to call our meeting to order at 8:17. Today we have a full agenda with several important items. We're going to spend the bulk of our time reviewing our charge and completing our work plan as a committee for the next calendar year. We will hear a full report on the Minority Teacher Act from Hilda Roselli. And then the last portion, we will spend time talking about our charge for out-of-school youth and the work product that we hope to complete as a committee. And if we have time after that, we will begin the discussion of hiring with an equity lens. So if I could ask Doris to help lead us through the document we have that's called the year calendar worksheet, and I would propose that we actually make this a working portion of the meeting where we try to get as much progress as possible so we can complete this sheet. So lead us away, Doris.
Okay, good morning, and thank you, Chair Marr. Good morning, Dr. Henry. Seth, if you wouldn't mind putting this out for the audience, that would be helpful. So what you have before you as a committee is a document entitled the Equity and Partnership Subcommittee Year Calendar Worksheet. And the intent is to be able to provide the OEIB what the focus areas of this subcommittee will be during the calendar year, during the 2013-2014 year. So I started with the purpose of the committee, and again, this is suggested from staff, so if there are any changes that you'd like to see, any comments, then we're going to use this as an opportunity to have that conversation. The purpose is to ensure that the work of the OEIB and the state education enterprise is focused on meeting the diverse needs of every Oregon learner and supports a vision of education equity and excellence, and it says for all. I'm going to just say, I'm going to ask you whether or not you have any questions, issues, because it does change a little bit our direction as a committee. Not much, it's still focused on equity, but we were very specific as we worked through last year with some other charges. So that's the purpose, and then there's some suggested foci.
So just to clarify, there's the OEIB mission, and then this is a new, kind of a restated purpose for this particular committee.
That's correct, for this particular subcommittee.
For me, I need a little bit of time to sit with it before I can respond, so I need to think about it a little bit.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go through the foci, and then we can either continue with the conversation or we can have time to think about it and talk about it at the November meeting, whichever works for the subcommittee. So there are several foci, and I put these in a worksheet so that you would have an opportunity to comment and then think about what the deliverable would be, so that so it's not just a conversation that we're having, but we're actually delivering a tangible product back to OEIB that would be helpful in moving it along, as well as a timeline. So the first focus area is to monitor and support the implementation of the equity lens. And then there's some areas underneath that focal area. And then the next one is to provide a highly visible platform for engagement from voices representing communities of color, non-native English speakers, families in poverty, and disengaged youth. And then the next focus area is to develop policy recommendations aimed at improving accountability and services to disengaged youth. And then the last one is to develop policy recommendations aimed at incenting and elevating parent, family, and student engagement in education. So we could take each one of those individually, The end of the document has some questions, and the questions are to generate conversation and thinking about what the focus of the committee would be. So if you want to start with the first one, which is to monitor and support the implementation of the equity lens.
Yeah, so I think I have a couple overall comments. One is that it seems like partnership is missing from the whole document. So this idea that we as a system of education can't do it all ourselves and need to be thoughtful about partnering, that voice is, or that value is missing from the entire document. So we need to think about how to embed that in the purpose and then embed that throughout our activities.
Okay, so can I point you to the second one? And say that that starts that conversation, and we might want to either call it out separately or add it in there, whichever is.
I don't see it in there. That seems to be more about listening to different voices we may not hear from. It doesn't actually speak to partnership.
Okay.
The other piece that I would say about the entire document is that it's it's very much about activities and effort and not outcomes. So it looks like it's a lot of sort of having a meeting or listening to someone or doing a discussion, and I would be concerned that we could do all of these things and we might not have any different outcomes for young people. So I think I might be a little bit more concrete in some of the activities as I list them. Granted, that might be a problem with the format of the document, but that would be another direction.
Okay.
And then more specifically, with the equity lens, I think that these are good activities, but we actually have not shared the equity lens really with anyone, and so I think that there's some initial activities around just sharing it with partners. I don't think the appropriate promotion and distribution has really taken place with the actual lens. So while I'd like to believe that other agencies and organizations might use it, I don't think they even know it exists. Some do, who are very much in our own circles, but I think there's a lot of work of sharing to be done. I would also say that there's probably a need for some very specific activities around and we would probably be more on the policy or recommendation side, but around contracting and grant making. I've had a lot of very strong feedback from communities that while we passed an equity lens, we then turned around in our initiatives and our grant making that we've made has not really reached out to many communities or even been available for diverse communities to compete. And so I think that contracting and grant making, how we partner with the Department of Education has to be sorted. And I think that would be a really appropriate activity for us in this next year. I think
one of the things would be to share what we are currently doing around the equity lens as well, because we have done quite a bit outside of an internal conversation with staff. So being able to share that with the subcommittee might be helpful as well.
Yeah, that would be good information to have. And then I think it's great to get out there and be highly visible and all of those. I just would want to be really clear about why and what for, because communities don't want engagement for the sake of engagement. They actually want us to do something with it. So we just have to work to get clearer on that. And then I would say in the disengaged youth piece, I think that we should hold ourselves accountable to deliver a full set of policy recommendations in the next year, and that should be a primary focus of our work. And I think we have, I would think that presentations from folks doing work with GEDs, the City Club Initiative, some of our alternative schools would be equally or more valuable than the Youth Development Commission presenting. It's a great compliment, but I think really
It
review.
expands that.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I'm sure I'll have other comments.
So have GED and alternative schools, you said something else that I missed.
I think we should hold ourselves accountable for a comprehensive set of policy recommendations about
Can't have that.
out-of-school youth. So
I agree.
I'm probably missing some groups that could present to us. But.
Just a couple of quick comments, and I'm not sure, I know we'd raised at one point issues around rural populations, and I'm not sure if you meant for them, Dr. Miko, to be subsumed in some of these other discussions. I saw families in poverty, disengaged youth. And this may just be some flag that I'm waving, but I believe that there's a significant population, a rural population in our state that is feeling disenfranchised, not because they're rural, but because of the way that things have grown with respect to the capacity in some rural committees to support education. And I brought this to the attention of our Department of Education, and I think it just seems as though there's a stream in here that we need to attend to in some kinds of ways. I want to support Nicole's call for with outcomes, and I think that will then help us develop partnership pieces in a fuller kind of way. I admit that I have almost a personal interest in the Youth Development Council, but I also agree that, and I think the Youth Development Council can be more effective with our partnering with them and working through several kinds of issues. We have to deal with the fundamental issue around what happens to youth when they are not in our major educational institutions. And I'm not sure if we've done that. I think we've had some ideas about what that looks like. We've had in the past, when we had the Commission on Children and Families, we had conversations with the Oregon Youth Authority and a variety of other kinds of places. But we have a large number, not a large number, too large a number of incarcerated youth,
Yes.
and some issues that go from what happens when incarcerated youth are released and they are back in various communities, and they are not going to high school, they're not in school, and that transition that has not been, at least this is my opinion, and I need some data to back that up, has not been smooth. And we also know that we have a large percentage of, and I'm not even sure if youth is the right term, who come into our community colleges who did not do well in high school and are usually tracked into so-called remediation, who there's a gap there in terms of the kinds of things that need to happen. So my premise is, if we're going to reach 40-40-20, we're going to have to put some focus in our formally adjudicated youth and our youth population, and now I'm talking about more of the 20 to 25, 26 population that did not get an adequate education, very possibly because it was interrupted by incarceration. So my questions for us are do we have a focus with that? If so, how does that tie to the other kinds of work that we're doing? And how do we both encourage best practice with respect to that and develop some new ways of thinking around it? And I didn't mean to say all that, but I guess I did. So.
Any feedback you'd like to share? Okay.
And I apologize for being late. I spent an hour of quality time on 217 this morning
Oh.
for 2 accidents.
Very good.
Glad you're here.
So now I'm just trying to catch my breath.
So that's kind of the feedback, I think, for what's here, and I actually have a couple suggestions for elements that I believe we should add, and I'm very cognizant that maybe I'll be making this too long of a list for us to get it done, but if so, one of them I actually think we should elevate, which, and if someone in another subcommittee is working on this and I'm just not aware of it, then we should talk about that, but specifically, we have some very significant equity issues with students on IEPs and special education in general, and our equity lens intentionally called out race, and I'm very glad that we did it that way, but we did not have the chance to call out special education in the way that the state probably deserves to have attention to that. And I don't know if our focus this year should be the overrepresentation of students of color on IEPs and addressing that, or if there needs to be a larger effort around special education in the way that we have really focused on English language and on and race specifically. But I think that that's a really critical area that needs attention. I don't know.
Speaking to my heart.
Okay, that's for you, Doris. And then the other piece I would say is that I think that we may need to call out implementation of the equity lens in higher education and in early childhood, because I have real concerns that even though I think that this committee worked very hard to create elements within the equity lens that ensure that the community colleges, higher ed, and special ed were also under that policy, I'm not sure that those groups are aware that they are expected to be held to the equity lens. And so I think that we need to be conscientious and maybe just spend some time thinking through that.
So one of the things, yes, and I don't disagree, one of the things that I want the committee to be aware of is that I did present the equity lens to the Early Learning Council, and they adopted the equity lens last spring. They're using the equity lens as an opportunity to have conversations about their grant development, as well as how they're putting their policies together. So that's there.
I'm not as worried
But
about
that
the
doesn't
committee,
negate-
but I'm more
Yeah.
worried about the
The
field.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So it doesn't negate the
Yeah.
need to have that conversation across the state, both in higher ed as well as in the early childhood.
And I'm not sure what that would look like. I just feel like, again, I'm not as worried about the governing committees that exist. I'm more worried about, and it's not our role to manage the day-to-day, and we need to be really cognizant of that. But I think that this is still new enough that if we're intentional, I don't know exactly what that would look like, but I still have a perception that folks really think the equity committee only applies to K through 12.
I do think that in the hub applications, they had to identify the communities in their area and particular needs and how they were going to address it. And I don't know if it was specifically stated as race, but I do know that they needed to look at the minority groups and how to meet all those needs. We haven't read those yet, so I'm not sure.
It might be helpful on both of your points to invite the interim chancellor and the community college interim commissioner to come before us and to have some discussion about how the equity lens is being used in their various entities. For that higher ed, I agree with you. There's been this tendency to say it's a K-12, not that it isn't,
Right.
but to say it's a K-12 only, and that might help.
Well, and also to blame the disparities that exist on K-12 for the reason that disparities exist in higher ed.
Right.
So I think, I like that suggestion a lot. I think that doing the same in early childhood would be really helpful too, because I think historically we've always asked applicants who they will serve and how they will reach out to population. It doesn't mean they actually then do it or are held accountable for those outcomes. So I think we have to think about that. But does that seem reasonable, Doris, as a first step?
It seems reasonable, but I would want to expand the perspective. And so I'm going to offer the suggestion that it's not only the what the institution says they have in place, but the experiences that people who are actually in the institutions have to share with us as well. So if we're having chancellors come before us, I would also want to invite students and faculty. Well, faculty may have a vested interest for their belief being around the chancellors, but students and student groups won't have that same.
Yeah.
So I would encourage us to get, if we're talking about partnerships and engaging really the communities, then I think we really want to hear from the communities.
I absolutely agree, and I think particularly with early childhood, I think we should ask and invite folks who represent that continuum, and then the community advocacy groups who've been advocating for better equality in early childhood services. So I think that's a wonderful, and it might be even of good value to really, for example, have a panel come and talk about the unique needs from the perspective of, for example, the Latino community or the African American community, and folks who are not necessarily part of the system per se, so that we can have that really honest feedback. I think we are setting ourselves a very ambitious year-long calendar, but I
Just going to
think
point that out.
I think that if we can sort of stagger certain pieces, have very concrete outcomes. For example, I feel strongly about the disengaged youth and the special education piece, because I just don't feel like we have any time to spare. I think we should really have some very concrete policy recommendations. I think in some of these other areas, we may be working more on institutional culture change and informing ourselves so that we will get to a place where we can make the most helpful and supportive recommendations. We probably are not going to solve all of these issues this year, and I think we need to be ambitious, we need to be urgent, but we also have to be realistic, considering we have one meeting a month and so forth. Doris, does that give you enough information to?
It does. And what I'll do is, Nicole, is I'll put together what I think I'm hearing,
Okay.
and send that out to you, all of you, and then get your feedback on whether I captured it. I'll also put in what I think might be realistic timelines for you and who we might invite, with the understanding that they're coming to us not for a presentation, but for some kind of action that we're going to do as a result of that. Because I don't think sitting and hearing and discussing is going to get us any place as a subcommittee.
Dr. Golden, not to put you on the spot, do you have any comments or anything you'd like to add to this discussion?
Well, I'm just, should I talk here?
Wherever you feel most comfortable.
I think when I get to talk at OEIB today, I'm going to talk a lot about what we're doing around equity lens, and I know that in our organization we're looking at our actions. So even language using like acronyms or bills that mean a lot of people can't understand the conversation. We've just put together a network, so when we do new hires, we can make sure they're reflective of our communities. And, I do think it's important, and the conversation kind of started here, but I will bring this to the P20 Council, that we all hold ourselves accountable. I know recently, whenever I've had the opportunity to present, I present parts of the beliefs around the equity lens, and I've been getting extraordinary results. I mean, when I did it at LCC, people cheered. And this weekend when I was at the parent training for a Latino community in Salem, I talked about how second language is an asset. I also talked about how our cultures are what's great about our state, the increased diversity in our culture. So I do think we can go deeper around, it needs to start with us, and not only us, but not only the Chancellor of Higher Ed, there's everyone, and I would say ODE, and I think they've made some good progress in their hires. We need to do that. So I need to take it to P20 Council. So I guess the next thing is to say, what are the other existing infrastructures, we need to really get very public about, we're going to be working on them. That would be great.
Any thought on the special ed piece that we're proposing to add?
So when I met with the Portland Parent Union, I heard some pretty heart-wrenching story about 5-year-olds being referred to special ed in the first week of school. And to me, what that really signals is that we haven't created the systems inside our public schools, so when maybe a child needs some differentiation in the curriculum or some supports, that our educators know how to get that. So I'm really excited that you're really looking at the special ed issues, because with my travels around the state, that's a key one that I'm hearing about. And being a district that moved to response to intervention, which is a model that is getting results, I know once we had that model in place, we were able to serve all of our children much more effectively. So I do think we need to talk about best practice models along with this, because I think everyone has good intentions, but if the systems aren't there, they don't know where to go. So,
But I think we will need some help in crosswalking some of the systems, because I know for many parts of the state, their early intervention systems are completely missing entire populations of color. So when you look at actually who gets referred for early intervention, you'll see almost no Native Americans or no Latinos or no African Americans. And the reason is, in some communities, those folks aren't accessing Head Start or any of those services, so they're not in the environments where they're being assessed. Even if they are being referred, they're not going because there's not an option that's comfortable for them, or they're not having a good experience. And so they have pretty solvable challenges. If they had that early intervention, they'd be fine. They're not getting it, and then they're showing up to kindergarten or first grade, and then 25% of Native Americans are suddenly on an IEP in grade school. And it's really about an early childhood continuum and access issue. And I think where we will need help as a subcommittee is sort of support in having those conversations in a way that allows us to make helpful recommendations, because that sort of probably jurisdiction and policy-wise falls under the Early Learning Council, Youth Development Commission, us, and and the Department of Ed doing the contracting for those services that isn't reaching those populations. So navigating that will be a little bit tricky, but I don't think we'll be successful unless we try to think about it.
So that's very consistent with the P20 and Start Early, because I know the special ed services that are provided for young students, it really does allow for a much smoother transition. Teams are meeting, and students get much smoother transitions as they move into school. So I agree with you, that's probably the place to start.
Yeah.
I think it's both a structural issue, but it's also a belief issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that when you walk into a classroom and you're putting 5-year-olds into special education as an example, that's a belief about a group of people needing to be placed someplace without even looking at what they come, the assets that they bring. So I think we really have to call it for what it is, that part of it is a systems problem, but part of it is a belief problem that we also have to deal with. And I really like, Nicole, your comment about institutional culture change, because that is really key to moving this work.
May I ask a golden question? Do you think that the kindergarten...
Do you have a microphone? I'm really having trouble hearing you.
Yes. Do I?
Yes.
Okay. Kindergarten readiness assessments, do you think that had anything to do with those referrals to special education for 5-year-olds?
I don't have any information about that. That would be something that would be...
That isn't what it's supposed to be.
No, it's been a chronic issue for years and years and years.
Okay.
Yeah.
But that's a good question, because that could become an unintended consequence. So, yeah, so we need to watch for that, for sure.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Invite you up. Okay, I think we're going to move on, if that's okay. Great. Can we invite Hilda Roselli to join us to lead us through a conversation on the Minority Teacher Act? And Doris, if you want to give any more introduction, I would welcome you to do that.
I am pleased to have my colleague, Hilda Roselli here to expand upon our conversation from the last meeting about the Minority Teacher Act. And she also has Markeisha Smith, new employee with the Department of Education. So we're very, very pleased to have both of them. They have received the set of questions that we discussed at the last meeting and have formed an opportunity to expand upon that and then engage the committee, the subcommittee, in a discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Doris. Good morning, and it is a pleasure to be here. My name is Hilda Roselli, and I serve as a director at OEIB with particular focus around matters related to educator preparation, as well as post-secondary education and college and career readiness. And as Doris mentioned, I'm joined here by my colleague, Markeisha Smith. And I'd like to kind of give you an idea how we're going to use our time today, because we'd like to use some of this for some engagement. I first want to thank you for the questions. They were very thoughtful and deliberate around some important issues that we are also vested in addressing. What we'd like to do to start off with is I will share some initial responses to the questions, which I've clustered. And I do have all of this written out in a way that if you'd like it, you may obtain a copy of it. I just was trying to not overwhelm us with PowerPoints and handouts, and I already ended up giving you 3 handouts. So. Secondly, I'll turn it over to my colleague Markeisha, who will give you an overview of some promising practices and model programs that we're looking at in other parts of the nation. Third, we'd like to engage you in a discussion and timely input. And if we can't get your feedback today, what I would encourage is that we create a way that you can share your input and ideas with us as we are in the process of trying to finalize a draft for how we will utilize the strategic investments around educator recruitment that were part of the Network for Quality Teaching and Learning. And fourth, I'm not trying to add to your list of foci, but I do anticipate that there'll come a time later in the year that we would want to come back and bring you a draft of some, or sort of an outline of how we'd like to envision the Minority Teacher Report being laid out, which is part of the Minority Teacher Act, Senate Bill 755. So if that works for you, I think that's how we can use our time. And Doris, please wave when we need to move on, okay? I tried to allot 15 minutes for the first 2 sections and then the rest of the time for discussion. I think one of the most distinctive aspects of the Minority Teacher Act that was passed during the legislative session that is new for us is the inclusion of some new language around defining minority. And it is going to cause some thoughtful, strategic processes that we do not have currently in place to be able to really define persons whose first language is not English. That's the language in the bill, and it means that at every step of the way in which we are reporting data, we need to create mechanisms that gather that data and help us report it, because that is not something that is systematically collected. The big issue, not the big issue, but the big task for us that lies ahead is, of course, to actually see movement and change. And the goal that was set for us is that by July 1st, 2015, it is hoped that we would have increased by 10% compared to 2012 data the number of minority teachers and administrators employed in Oregon school districts and ESDs, as well as the number of minority students enrolled in public teacher education programs. And I bring that to your attention because it will create a little bit of a dilemma for us about how we create changes in a pipeline that takes more than 2 years frequently to play out. So hopefully we are going to provide you with some ideas about how we hope to engage in both levels. As the bill states, we will be reporting data on a biennial basis to the legislators, and we'll be working closely with the Oregon University system and the public colleges that are involved in educator preparation, the Department of Education that monitors hiring data, Teacher Standards and Practices Commission that reports on individuals holding licenses in Oregon, as well as community colleges who are often frequently the early pipeline, as well as school districts that are engaged in efforts around this area, and we'll share a little bit more about that later. We'll also be looking, we've been asked specifically to look at comparisons of, this is from the bill, minority and non-minority scores on basic skills, pedagogy, and subject matter tests. I think that this will do one of two things. One, it could distract people from the most important aspect of our work around, the tests, to perhaps also pointing out the structures that we should be providing all students. Access to tutoring, access to online, anytime access to tutorials that help you think about the kinds of exams and licensure tests that you take. This is done in the field of law all the time, so we need to build upon that. In terms of an initial timeline, no later than July 1st, 2014, we will be bringing forward a report to the interim legislative committees on education, and that will be engaging our partners, obviously, in helping to put that together. And I'd like to come back to this committee as we draft some outlines to get feedback. What I also saw in your questions was an opportunity to provide some updated data, some newer data that builds upon what we've known since the last minority teacher report was published in 2011. So there's a two-page, I think it's back and front document that has a chart on the front, and I just laid out 4 levels of data for you to consider. And certainly I know that you'll want to dig into this, and I'm available later by email to answer any questions that you may have. But I thought it was important to just point out that we are going to be experiencing a teacher shortage in Oregon. And this has been projected from data that's been provided by the Oregon Employment Department and analyzed through Ed Northwest as part of a conditions of education report that was recently shared by Chalkboard. So when you start to look at the discrepancy that we are all aware of between students of color in our schools and the education workforce demographics, not only is it already a dramatic discrepancy, but it potentially could get worse if we do not take dramatic steps, particularly when we consider that by 2020 we may be needing over 16,000 new teachers. And who knows, I've heard people say that after the special session that just concluded last week, there could be even more people thinking about retirement in the public school system. In addition to that, I provided you with more current data from the Title II report that spells out by university what has been reported about enrollment. And I think it's important for us to consider that quite often in these kinds of reports, we look at people who apply, people who enroll, and people who complete. And I didn't provide you with every single data point for 2012 on that, but I thought it was interesting for you to look at the universities that reported their numbers, and it's looking right now for these data at about a 13.1% presence of non-white. Now here's one of the issues that we have to also address, and that is that sometimes the way we lay out the data makes it difficult for students to answer. And I've also been having some conversations about how we can engage a messaging about why would I want to answer a question about my race and ethnicity. So that's also part of this challenge that we have. The next table for your review later on is a fascinating piece of information that I was given by TSPC that actually looks at licensures held within the state of Oregon. These are people who have kept their license current, and I need to give you a caveat that says there's many reasons why they may not be currently employed. Could be that I have decided to go to graduate school. Could be that I have not been able to get a job. part of the downward employment market has impacted job opportunities for our most recent graduates. And so even if we may be increasing some of our minority presence in our recent graduating classes, they may also be finding it extremely difficult to obtain employment in a downward market. Also, I could be considering an option of another career. I could have also been employed and been discouraged with the culture and conditions of my work environment. One of the things that's going to be interesting for us is that part of our Network for Quality Teaching and Learning will be using an instrument called the TEL, which is a survey that actually looks at conditions of employment. This will be the first time we really have that kind of a broad data point from educators in the state, and that will be one of the areas that we look to see. Are we seeing people comment about the culture of their working environment and how that changes their perspectives about staying in the field?
Just to clarify, so all the things that you shared that teachers of color could be experiencing, white teachers could be experiencing as well, and yet their unemployment is not as high, with the exception of Hispanic.
That's correct. The other last piece that I must also point out, because the research does indicate that this can be a factor, and that is that I may have another better opportunity for a higher salary, more independent professional responsibilities, and that could influence my decision. We don't know any of those.
I mean, that's a pretty big
paths.
assertion, considering when you look at every piece of data for communities of color that the overall income opportunity and job promotion is not higher. So I think
Right.
that's a really interesting.
I just mention it because it is in the literature as a factor, and we do not have any idea yet what is happening with these individuals. That's one of the things that maybe we need to look at through our new policy and research arm in OEIB. And the last data was provided, oh yes, I'm sorry, Nicole?
Well, I'm just surprised, I guess. I just want to push back a little bit. You've just given us a million reasons why teachers of color unemployment rates are higher than whites, but you haven't, I mean, there's also some negative reasons that could be true, like racism, biased hiring.
I think that's what I meant by the conditions of the culture of the school.
Okay.
And that's why I'm so excited about this survey that we will be using for the first time, that actually gives us an opportunity to look at what is occurring in that culture and whether or not that has an impact on that. I'm very in agreement with you, Nicole, that that's a major area but what we don't know yet is what's contributing to the picture in Oregon.
Okay.
But I find this fascinating data, and not many people know about it.
Yeah, it confirms a lot of suspicions I think many communities have had, so I really appreciate it. I just get nervous when we oftentimes in Oregon's politeness we try to excuse certain things, and I hope that we can
Now,
just
that's
be
not
really
my
blunt.
intention whatsoever, so thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah.
And the last grid was simply some data that I had obtained from a 2012 report, and I find it fascinating. It's called Portland Metro, which I'm sure Salem Kaiser doesn't know that they're part of a Portland Metro area, but it just points out in our greatest communities of color, the discrepancies continue to be alarming in terms of the percentages of teachers and the percentages of students of color and second language. So briefly, I found a number of questions items in your questions that related to what are the barriers for changing this picture. And not only is this based on some research relative to the national picture, because this is certainly not a new issue that has been studied, but in terms of factors here within our own state. I think that we have to consider things such as the fact that right now we have need for more support systems and clear advising. I just did something interesting this morning. I do it occasionally when I'm up and having my coffee. I Google things like become a teacher in Oregon, and I just look to see what do I pull up today. And quite often I pull up websites that are not very helpful, are not very authentic, and are not certainly official from the state perspective. I even uncovered one recently that had our state seal on it. Then I discovered that a company is out there doing that for every state. So they're using every state seals on individual state pages. So we're looking into that to see if that's actually legal. So that's one thing, is the need for better information and clear one-stop shopping around how do I find out about a career in education. I think we also have to be able to provide more role models in our colleges and connect people within the community. So I'm going to share with you some ideas in the last phase of our presentation about how we hope to do that with some strategic investment dollars from the network. We're also going to have to face right up front interviewing and hiring practices. And I'm delighted that 5 projects that are underway this year under the auspices of Teach Oregon have embedded in their work not only recruitment activities to define and increase the percentage of teachers of color and second language in the pool of candidates, but they've also included specific work that they are going to be doing around preparing school districts around more culturally responsive interviewing techniques and recruitment pools and hiring practices, which have to be embedded in that. And we can't think about this issue without looking at retention factors. There's a wonderful report that I was reading from a noted researcher that was specifically looking at that, Ingersoll's recent work. And it mirrors again that if we do not pay attention to the community or the school culture, we may be recruiting people and hiring them, but then not keeping them, and that's what we have to answer. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Markeisha, who has done some great research on some promising programs that we're looking at, trying to learn from, and keeping in touch with relative to their work in this area.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Hilda. So there is a handout you have that is entitled at the top, Minority Teacher Recruitment Across States. And this was data from 2010. And so for this work, we thought it was really important to ground it in considering what other states are doing in terms of minority teacher recruitment and retention. And what you have here is just a sample of what that looks like across the states. And so there are currently 31 states that do have policy legislation that is specifically geared toward minority recruitment, teacher recruitment and retention. So of the sorts of recruitment incentives that go on, there seems to be a lot of focus on scholarships or grants. Often that is tied to in some way a commitment of maybe a 3 to 5 year service in an area of shortage or in hard to staff schools, as the research indicates. There also seems to be a focus on these sort of cadet programs, which are looking at students in middle and high school and doing some sort of recruitment activity at that level to get students really interested and excited about teaching as an option, as a profession. So just to sort of give you an idea of the sorts of activities that are going on across the states. One of the other things that was really interesting to sort of dig into was to think about some of the specific models in more detail. And so the bottom half of the first side of the sheet and then on the back, there were 5 that we decided to highlight as a part of what we're sharing with you today. And you sort of get, a really good sense of the things that are taking place, the sorts of activities that are connected to these programs. Teach Tomorrow actually had an opportunity to speak with the founder, CEO, I'm not sure what her title is, but about that program specifically. And one of the things that she really talked a lot about was this focus on retention. And so they do a lot to really support the teachers once they're in the classroom, beyond just, a first year sort of thing. And so there's often, a mentorship thing that, happens to really make sure that the teachers that are in these environments feel comfortable and are asking the questions and getting the sort of professional development that's really important to their well-being and their decision to stay in the teaching profession. You'll notice that in Washington, there is, that's number 4, a program that really looks at this whole issue of the cadet model. And so thinking about how we can connect students at a really young age to information about the teaching profession. So that's another good model. Kentucky, that's number 5 on the list on the back, goes beyond just the initial teaching license and really is thinking about how to get minority individuals as a part of administration programs and also in superintendent programs as well. And so they take that, to a higher level. And I think that was, out of all the ones I found, one of the only programs that's really going beyond just, the teacher in the classroom and thinking about those leadership roles. We would have been, remiss not to think about what's happening here in Oregon and to think about how that shapes the work that we're doing. And so you'll notice there on the back side of the sheet, we've highlighted what's happening at Portland Community College. There's a Portland Teachers Program that's looking at partnerships with school districts, local school districts, and four-year institutions to provide support for students of color. They look broadly at developing culturally competent teachers, but there is a component that is really, focusing in on those teacher candidates of color. The Western Oregon University Bilingual Teacher Program is another piece as we're thinking about English learners and the needs of the English learner population. And so there are some study sessions that are happening there, some reimbursement for test fees. I know a lot of the dilemma when it comes down to actually taking these tests is, how am I going to afford this, in light of everything else that has to be taken care of. And that's one of the things, just as a university professor myself, I would often hear from students. And so there's a lot going on there with some help, some financial support for teachers. University of Oregon has a program that's happening with the Native American population and thinking about how to get them involved, and again, some financial assistance to help with tuition and fees, book allowances, some technology assistance there as well. And then Teach Oregon, which, as Hilda mentioned, is really doing a lot in terms of, this focus on recruitment, retention, hiring practices, all of that. And those grants are really doing a great job at considering all those components and how they help to get our teaching staff where it needs to be in light of what our data says. And then finally, just some other models that would be noteworthy that we didn't add here in detail are some things that are happening with teacher cadet programs in states like Connecticut and New York, Oklahoma. There's some university scholarship programs that are happening as well. Community College Link, you have there, Rio Honda Community College is doing some work in that area. And then just thinking about earlier national efforts, the Pathways to Teaching is another sort of historic look at how this work has been shaped. Right? So.
I just have one recommendation.
Sure.
We have a really interesting case study in Oregon, and I'm really glad that you included the Subcommittee program for U of O. But actually, Oregon is a state that is the single state who's received the most resources from the Department of Indian Education for teacher demonstration projects. We've received over $10 million. Lewis and Clark received a significant, over $1 million grant. U of O's received 2. Portland State currently has one, Southern Oregon currently has one, and Oregon State had one as well. So I think it's about $12 million that has come to the state to start Native teacher education programs. The data on sort of who is in these programs, it's really tricky because more Native Americans actually identify as multi-ethnic than Native American, even though they're tribal members, so that makes it quite tricky both for our student population and our teacher population. But the interesting and disappointing thing is that we've actually educated quite a few Native American teachers in the state. And it would be interesting to look at why those folks are unemployed. Many of them are. But it's also really interesting to note that most of those institutions receive multi-million-dollar grants, use the resources to have a Native teacher focus, and as soon as the grants came to an end, they immediately dropped off having Native student populations in their teacher program. So we just have an interesting case study. You would think that with that amount of resource and investment that really came because of a unified effort between the tribes and the urban Native community to create a whole bunch of highly qualified teachers, that we would have a different picture today. So something happened that has not allowed us to have the success you might think, and I think that that lesson might be valuable as we implement new programs or think about other populations, because clearly lots of money and resources wasn't the answer when there wasn't a long-term institutional and professional commitment to diversifying and actually finding ways for those highly qualified individuals to get hired. So,
And that's really good information. In our equity unit, which is the team that I'm a part of at ODE, we have hired an educational specialist specifically looking at Native American students in the Native American community. So that is something that we can talk about as a team and see how she can help to inform that work. Thank you.
So that actually leads us to the last document that you have, which is listed as a draft. I wrote draft in big letters and small letters because this is a work in progress. And Doris and I were talking this morning, should we give this out publicly? But it's actually been enhanced with the input that I've gotten from a variety of individuals that I've had a chance to talk with, and we really welcome the input of this subcommittee to this work. House Bill 3233, which is actually the Network for Quality Teaching and Learning, included specific funding around educator recruitment, as well as strengthening educator preparation programs, including a more diverse workforce. And so what we have done here is outline some ideas about how we can use what we call a strategic investment, not replacement dollars, and certainly not something that is expected to be sustained from the state level, because we would need to go back to our legislators with results if we intended to see that this really made a difference. But with Nicole's suggestion here, all of this is designed to simultaneously not only increase the number of students that are engaged in educator preparation programs, but to start to build that systemic, sustained effort at the institutions and within the state that is needed to keep this work moving forward. The very first item, which is, I just called it recruitment, and recruiting Oregon educators presence, is based on the fact that right now it's very difficult to find out how to become a teacher in Oregon and to get started on that path. Whether I'm a career changer or I'm a middle school student, either way it's difficult. And in fact, today when I Googled, you do land eventually on TSPC's website, which reminds you that they no longer are issuing paper licenses. So it's not a very, welcoming, oh, we're so excited you landed here. And here is some, clear guidance about why you might want to think about the education profession. So we need to do a better job of actually pulling together a one-stop shop that actually gives real elevated status to this career, and engages people who are employed in the school districts who may want to pursue licensure because they've had positive experiences working as instructional assistants, career changers, and our traditional pipeline of students that start really at middle school sometimes thinking about their careers. With this, we want to purposely connect to many of the service learning opportunities that are sponsored by groups that work closely with students of a traditional age, whether it be through the migrant youth leadership or Native American youth programs or particular Aspire or various types of community groups. We need to make that link so that they too see how they can help support young people's dreams about becoming an educator and using some service learning experiences as early stepping stones. For example, I found one novel program that for the number of hours that students were actually engaged in service learning with younger students in school-based activities, they could earn points towards a free laptop or a free iPad. So there's some ways that we can incent and engage youth in purposeful ways there.
Dean, Ms. Sullivan,
Yes.
Chair, any thought, and this is going to sound a little left fieldish, I think, until it connects, with returning veterans and persons who are
That's a very
leaving the
good point.
military service.
Troops to
Both-
teachers, yes.
Yeah, both in terms of there being
Yeah.
some funds available and in terms of Oregon has had a very active profile
Yes.
of military persons, and that also includes a fair number of persons of color because of the larger numbers of persons of color in the military. Any kinds of ways to...
Absolutely, and in fact, some of us have had some personal experience with programs such as Troops to Teachers, and also are using some of the federal dollars, which we are watching Congress to see if it continues, but we've been able to use some of the TEACH grants as well to enhance those packages to help students. But those are in some specific areas, and there's still discussion about whether or not that will continue in the future.
Thank you.
Nicole?
I think these are great recruitment strategies, but part of the reason I shared that earlier example is that it's a really important example about how you can recruit a bunch of people who want to be teachers to the profession and they still don't get hired, and oftentimes when they do get
That's my
hired.
second page.
Well, I've read the second page. Is that C? I've read. Is it just
well,
2 pages or? Because
I think that's where we start to think about the retention and hiring practices that have to accompany any recruitment effort.
So I guess I was thinking, I'm still thinking a little bit, I think those are, I read that and that looks fine. But it also seems like there's a missing piece around helping local school boards who have a significant amount of jurisdiction and authority with approving superintendent contracts and helping them to understand the value and the importance around hiring and having and the connection between educational outcomes and the reflection, and also supporting superintendents and administrators, because all of this is fine, but if there's no actual accountability and if there's not an understanding at the top leadership level of the value and the importance to educational outcomes for their district, it's not going to happen. And so, and you see a lot of examples where a lot of these good things have happened, but the outcomes don't change. And so,
I appreciate that, and we can
That would be part of
certainly
the-
strengthen the language around that, and also, that's actually one of the pieces that we're anticipating will come as some strategic practices that become recommended practices for school boards and HR offices, coming out of the 5 partnership projects, which involve 13 different educator preparation programs, and I forgot now exactly how many school districts. So we envision that that's going to create some documented evidence about what's working in these school districts, so that we can take that to the next step to really put pressure on everyone to think about how are you adopting those practices. And it may include also some, sensitivity, awareness, and even guided practice in using some different approaches to hiring, and then defining how your first year rolls out as a teacher.
yeah, because I just had so many experiences talking to young teachers from a variety of different communities of color, and just how difficult it is because of the bias and discrimination they experience, but also witnessing that happening to students can be quite traumatizing. And I'm just curious about where that fits in and resolving that issue. I know it takes time, but
Well, one of the things that I've been exploring is a concept for another initiative to address rural areas around e-mentoring, and a project that is being hosted by the New Teacher Center. And it dawned on me that while they are reaching out to provide supports to teachers who are in more geographically remote areas, to connect them with a small group of mentees and mentors that are all facilitated, so it's not just, emailing without any oversight and facilitated structure. But it dawned on me that the very same support may be needed for communities where we may have a teacher who has a second language or is a teacher of color, and they may be the only one in their district. So how do we provide a support system through either retired educators or other educators within the region to connect and support their continued involvement in the district? So
I just think the emphasis of this language is often about recruitment, and it makes it sound like the problems with why we don't have a diverse workforce are that we don't, it's almost like it's the fault of the students or we haven't recruited them well enough. And a lot of these measurable activities, you could say, oh, well, I tried to recruit them and I didn't get them. And there's not a real onus on changing our own institutions and the culture in a way that welcomes and takes advantage of all of the strengths. And I think that language, we need a shift in the tone of this document.
well, I would love to be able to make some of those edits and then get feedback from you all as to whether or not we've really addressed that sufficiently and made sure that the language does reflect that kind of a focus and priority.
I think one of the things that we took a risk, Hilda took a risk by bringing the document as a draft. And I think that part D is something Hilda and I can work on because the deliverables are not there.
Right.
And we need to flesh that out more because you're absolutely right. It's about retention practices. But even beyond that, it's about a belief. I have to go back to the fact that people have to, in their heart, change their thinking about how they interact with other people of other races, of other ethnicities, of just all around. It has to change in order for us to move forward. So I really think the deliverables have to be fleshed out a lot more than they are here. And Hilda and I meet every week. We're meeting in the morning, so we can make that a priority on our agenda and bring that back.
Thank you, Doris. I think your comment about beliefs, you're articulating it much better than I was, so I appreciate that. And we appreciate the opportunity to weigh in on the draft. I mean, the meeting is now, we might as well take the opportunity to give our feedback so that we can have a document that is truly reflective of what we all want to accomplish. Any other comments from the committee? And do you all have more, or?
I think that concludes where we were. And in fact, Doris, you reminded me, because we talked about this yesterday, that D was really where we thought you would be able to provide
wanting you to
specific feedback. So, so I'm sure that Doris will continue, bringing those suggestions from you all to our conversation. So I just thank you very much for this opportunity.
Dr. Henry might have a question.
I just said,
Yes.
and I think it's here. So what do you see as the next steps from here? Obviously, working with Doris in terms of working on this more. What?
The next steps would be that we have a weekly planning meeting at ODE with a group of colleagues, including Markeisha and Blake, who's here, and I'm trying to think if anybody else is here, a number of folks, and OEIB staff. And the focus of that is OEIB is not in charge of distributing the funds through the network or the student initiatives, but we are sort of that collective think partner around ensuring that the intentions of the legislation and the intentions of the OEIB vision, the equity lens, is all brought to bear on those investments. So this would then be defined through a variety of means. Sometimes I've identified what we sort of think might be a contract, what might be a competitive RFP, with those coming out hopefully before the winter holidays.
And that's where we would kind of, the equity team would sort of begin to look at the RFPs around this.
Does that answer? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break. So So we are actually going to start the conversation about the role of this subcommittee for addressing out-of-school youth. And what I'd like us to accomplish today is actually to kind of build out our skeleton of what we want to achieve in the next year and decide what our deliverable will be. So, I think earlier when we were creating our calendar, we made some ambitious statements like we would like to bring forward a full policy recommendation about our strategy for out-of-school youth. But part of the reason I think we were willing to be so ambitious is there's actually some really exciting things happening that we can collaborate with and help maybe bring some important pieces together. So folks may or may not be aware, but the City Club of Portland is right now doing an extensive audit and creating a full set of recommendations. And they're actually doing it statewide, which is really valuable to us. And they're focusing specifically on GEDs and the role of GEDs in Oregon, how they historically have been used, recent trends, and making a full set of recommendations about GED as a tool. So I would think that as we move forward and think of our out-of-school youth strategy, we would want to not duplicate the work that they've done. I believe they've interviewed about 50 different key stakeholders. They have a full committee of recognized educators working on it. So what I would recommend is that perhaps we invite the chair of that committee to come and share with us their work and assess if there's any strategies there that we might be able to look at, support, modify and support. I also think that we would want to take advantage of some of our alternative schools. We have some alternative schools in this state that have some pretty profound outcomes. And there may be an opportunity to learn from them. So I think what we would want to accomplish is maybe a three-pronged strategy that looks at the role of GEDs, the role of alternative schools, and then the role of, and where there's opportunity to make improvements of recapturing out-of-school youth and bringing them back to a regular educational setting. We know that's not right for everyone, but between GEDs, alternative schools, and retention and recruiting students back, we may have better success. Is there another prong of our policy recommendation we should be thinking about?
I would still like to see, if possible, for us to connect with the OEIB or
That's a great.
some of the other folks that have been doing work with older youth and
They're all
young
kids to
adults.
us.
I know they are, who are in multiple systems and sometimes get lost because they're go from multiple systems, and that might be a good starting place there.
So could we include Oregon Youth Authority? We have several mental health residential places for young people where they do receive their education. It seems like foster care, the foster care system fits somewhere in there. So it almost would be four-prong, with that being kind of one prong.
You mentioned alternative as well?
GED would be another prong, alternative. And I'm not coming up with very good language for this other really important one, which is how do we prevent students from leaving school, and then once they do leave school, make sure that we're doing everything to bring them back if it is a safe setting for them. I don't know if that's retention.
I'll work on some language for it. So I'm hearing 5 though. I'm hearing I'm hearing GED, I'm hearing alternative school, I'm hearing about recapturing youth, I'm hearing about OYA, and then I'm hearing foster care, mental health.
I kind of put OYA and residential and in one.
So residential
So we have several.
placements, okay.
Right, so we have like Cedar Bow and Christie Care and all of those places that serve very,
Nicole, what about, I mean, with your background in NIA, one of the things that a lot of the community agencies do is bridge the gap between various public
Yeah.
entities. How do we get a hold of that? Because our population is fluid, to say the least. What's your
Yeah,
take on that?
I think, so I mean, like if you look at the schools in the Portland metro area, you have about a 62% graduation rate across the board. You have about, the alternative schools have about 10% of the slots, so that gets you to 72%, and so then you're like, where are the other 28% of the kids? And they're frankly not in school or going between schools, and so, and there are many social service organizations who work very hard to, once they encounter those young people, place them back into a high school that's a good fit, place them into an alternative school. There are about 500 slots for GED attainment at PCC, but the completion rate is frankly very, very low. So, so there's.
So how do we bring, because I think this is a conversation we need to have with a lot of different, that it has been piecemealed out, and we need to bring some of those pieces in and have a more whole conversation. I'm not even sure how, but I just feel we need to do that.
Right, I think the question you're getting to is sort of who's responsible for those kids, right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of kids.
No, my answer is already there. We are.
Yeah.
So, but the question is, how do we then? I mean, one of the goals of the OEIB is to create this seamless piece there. It's not, and so my statement from that is, what do we need to do? Who do we need to talk to? How do we need to proceed such that it becomes more of an integrated whole than a
Right. Because what you'll hear from many of those young people is, I left school and no one ever came after me.
That's right. Some of them in their early teens.
Right.
I'm sure there's some report someplace that I can become more familiar with Oregon and what's going on with our students who have been allowed to disengage.
There is a decent report put together by Work Systems. Andrew McGough, the Work Systems director, he has some pretty fascinating data on just the thousands and thousands of kids between 14 and 21 who are just totally disengaged. I don't know how accurate it is, but that might be one recommendation. The other thing that I think we should address in our policy recommendations is the number of middle schoolers we're losing. They're not actually being captured in our 9th through 12th grade cohort graduation, but for some communities, the Hmong community is losing a significant number of middle schoolers, Slavic and Latino as well. And most of our dropout prevention conversations start in high school, and
They're already gone.
they're already gone. They're not even being counted as a dropout in that cohort.
And it's part of the House Bill 3232, which is intended to address, part of that addresses post-secondary aspirations, which are the mentoring programs at middle school. So we're just starting to work with language with ODE on funding opportunities for schools for that. So that'll be good. The other thing before you leave the policy recommendation on disengaged youth, I would want to have us think about prevention in some way. We have the Early Learning Council connection, and how do we make sure students don't end up in that pipeline, early on? So I don't quite know how to frame that yet, but I'd like to sit with it.
I think
and
that's
think about
Someone that might be some help in terms of talking about it, Randy Blazak. I think it's Blazak. He's a sociologist at Portland State University and has worked a lot with street youth, and could be a valuable resource. More of this stuff has gained attention for the more violent people, but some good info.
Well, I think if we dug down and made part of our policy recommendations, if we maybe did some introductions that really talked about the root causes, which I think our policy brief on overrepresentation of discipline and just overall discipline, even just for boys, would be an important root cause. I think over-identification and under-service of students with special needs and special education is probably another major root cause. Students will identify racism and bias as a major reason that they leave school. So I think if we can work to talk about the conditions that push students out, might be important. And then, and I know there are many others. A lot of behavioral health, mental health issues as well. And hopefully that will put us in a frame of more prevention as then we get down to these prongs of prevention and intervention. And I think we'll look to you, Doris, and probably to Nancy and others to make sure that we're keeping the set of policy recommendations at the right level that's appropriate for OEIB. And then my question would be to sort of figure out when you feel that it would be most appropriate to bring this policy recommendation to the full OEIB. And also what vetting processes we might need to undergo. I suspect it might be very similar to our equity policy where we intentionally went out and sought endorsements from a lot of different organizations prior to even bringing it to OEIB so that we had full support in the same way we did last time. So I don't know, is that in 9 months? Is that in 6 months? We tried to do the equity policy in 5 months? Is that, am I making that up? It goes very fast.
No, we started around this time of the year. We had them adopted in April, so it was a pretty ambitious timeline.
So do you have a thought about when? Make April a month again?
Yeah, let's just shoot for that.
Okay.
That'll keep it as a priority.
I think that the process we went through was a fine process, especially for the topic. I think for this topic, it's going to be even more difficult because there's a reason they're alienated youth. And so there are societal and structural and pieces that are rule bound and other pieces that aren't. So I just want to put us there in a reality about the whole issues around, and I'm not just going off on alienated youth, but we've traditionally built organizations and institutions with pretty specific missions, and continually, and when I say continually, I think over the last 60 years, this population has not been involved in where we've gone, and our hope is to bring them in with respect to some positive goals, but this is going to be a piece of
So
What they call a
just-
heavy lift.
Yeah.
This is going to be, it's a necessary lift, but it's not going to, equity was not easy, but this is going to probably be
Okay,
harder.
so we just recommended, we just discussed a possible 7-month time period. How much time would you propose that we need?
I'd say let's stick with the 7, but let's be realistic that this may be something that,
Well, I think that the 7 months will give us a time to at least have to the subcommittee enough of a draft to continue to vet.
okay.
I'm not saying that OEIB will approve the recommendation by April, but we should have something solid. Part of my background, I have worn many hats in the last 43 years. But when I started in education, I started in alternative education. So I was an alternative education teacher and an alternative education principal before I moved into traditional education. So this has a long history. You're right, a long history. A lot of interplay. I think that DHS and a lot of other agencies have to be involved in the conversation as well. So I'll frame something out for us to look at, and then on each of the agendas coming forward, we'll have that, so we'll know where we are. We'll know which community representation we're having to frame whatever that part of our conversation will be. So
Okay.
we'll see where we are in April, okay?
Yeah.
Sounds good, sounds good.
Well, and even if we have a solid set of recommendations and a policy structure at that point, you know, I think that would be a good marker. And we can always adjust if we need to, particularly as we build out the whole calendar and have all of the pieces that we're working on. We may have to rebalance, but I think if we give ourselves too long, it'll give us a,
Well, that means we lose more kids.
Yeah.
We're gonna try to stop the,
right.
I don't wanna call it a leakage, because it's really a dam.
Right.
We're going to do something.
We are hemorrhaging kids.
So our last activity on today's agenda is to just share a document that Doris has prepared for the committee and for our audience to review. And I'll just invite people if they have email comments to share that with Doris. We're not prepared to make it a full discussion today. And I don't see public testimony on the agenda today.
No, we didn't have public testimony.
Does anyone have any other items for the good of the order?
And I'll just say for the public, and if you'd like a copy of this to provide feedback, the OEIB staff and Dr. Golden's very conscious of hiring with an equity lens in mind. And so put together is a draft of ideas about how that can and might occur. So what I'd like to have the subcommittee do is provide any feedback, and I welcome the community to provide any feedback as well on the hiring practices that are set up here, what additions you've had from your experiences, things that have worked and not worked, so that as we consider the policies at our staff level, we are intentional about not only recruitment, but supporting people who we place into positions in OEIB.
Chair, we've had a guest who, I'm assuming she's, but I'm not sure of her title. Is it Vice Chancellor? Vice Chancellor Karen Mungell, who I guess I don't know why you're here, Karen, but thanks for being here. But has some considerations from higher ed, and if we could just invite for 90 seconds, 2 minutes, any thought that she has on what we've been doing in our agenda, because I think we should have all of this, all these pieces in there. So sorry to out you like this, Karen, but
Welcome, Karen.
It's my pleasure, thank you. Sam. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate the invitation. And I'm here today because we...
Would you state your name again
yes.
so that Seth has
Yes.
all of that information?
Karen Marenchel, I'm the Interim Vice Chancellor for Academic Strategies with the Oregon University System. And thanks again, it's great to see everyone. So I'm here today because we take equity and diversity very seriously in the Oregon University System, but we need help. And so, we're working currently on developing some policy around 40-40-20. So what it will mean for our campuses to achieve the governor's ambitious goal, and we know that we would like to incorporate the equity lens into that work. And so Doris and I have talked about working together to better understand the equity lens and how we might use it to inform that policy. We know that we need to reach a broader range of students. We just concluded a rather extensive study of diversity in our campuses and our achievement gaps. And they are there, and they are real, and we're not doing enough to address them. We also outlined a study that would get on campuses and talk to students. And so, Nicole, I was really pleased to hear you talk about inviting students to come here and talk, because that's exactly the direction that we have been going. We know we need to get onto campuses and talk with students about what they're experiencing, because in our office we typically talk with the administrators and sometimes we talk with faculty, and we don't really know what the experiences of students are like on our campuses, but we know from the data that they're not good across the board for all students. So we need to hear from more students about what's working for them and what's not working. The board in its history has done a good job of talking. So we've convened a lot of meetings. We do a lot of convening and a lot of talking, and we know what the best practices are out there. We don't know all of them, so we certainly need to know more. But I think that many of our folks have a handle on what needs to be done, but it's not getting done. And so anything that OEIB and the newly formed HEC can do to help institute and implement and ensure that those best practices are getting implemented on our campuses is going to be wonderful moving forward. So thank you for the invitation to say a few words.
Thank you.
I think I'm going to conclude our meeting today. Welcome.